In the early summer of 1189, a black lacquered chest was carried south out of the far north of Japan, and inside it, swimming in rice wine to slow the rot, was a man's head. It belonged to Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the most gifted battlefield commander of his generation, and it was being sent to his own brother as proof that the problem had finally been dealt with. By the time the chest reached the inspectors near Kamakura, weeks of summer travel had done their work, and the face inside could have been anyone. In that ruin, wrought by the summer heat, centuries of legend would find their opening, and many would come to believe the head in the box wasn't really his. In this version, Yoshitsune slipped the trap, vanished into the northern wilds, crossed to the Asian mainland, and reinvented himself as the most feared conqueror who ever lived. This is the theory, briefly mainstream in Japan, that Genghis Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire, was actually Japanese. Yoshitsune was born around 1159 into the Minamoto, one of the two great warrior clans tearing the country apart in the twilight of the Heian Age. His father picked the losing side of a palace revolt and didn't live to regret it, and his infant son was packed off to a mountain temple as a boy. He was given the name Ushiwakamaru and was expected to disappear forever, living as a monk. But he had other plans, and the legends say he trained in secret on the slopes of Kurama, where he learned how to fight from Tengu and other mountain spirits. Whatever the truth of that, he came down from the mountain a soldier rather than a monk. He found his way north to Hiraizumi and the protection of a powerful regional lord named Fujiwara no Hidehira, and there he waited. His moment came in 1180 when his older half-brother Yoritomo raised the Minamoto banners against the rival Taira clan in the conflict we now call the Genpei War. Yoshitsune rode to join him, and what followed made his name. At the Battle of Ichi no Tani in 1184, he supposedly led a cavalry charge straight down a cliff face the enemy thought impassable. He repeated these daring acts numerous times over the course of the conflict, and earned himself a reputation as a great commander who led from the front. In 1185, in the narrow straits at Dan no Ura, he shattered the Taira fleet and ended the Genpei War outright. He was hailed as a hero, and that's where the problems came for him, because winning on the battlefield turned out to be the easy part. Yoshitsune's problem was his brother, the man he commanded forces under. Yoritomo was building something no Japanese leader had managed before. He was laying the foundation of a genuine military government. He had no patience for a younger sibling who accepted honors from the imperial court without permission and behaved like a star. Brilliance on the battlefield curdled, in Yoritomo's eyes, into a direct threat to his new government. Within months of his greatest victory, Yoshitsune found himself declared an enemy of the state, hunted the length of the country by the very government his field command had built. He ran north again, back to Hiraizumi, back to the samurai family that had sheltered him as a boy. For a while it worked, but his old protector Hidehira died, and the son who inherited the domain, Fujiwara no Yasuhira, had neither his father's nerve nor his father's loyalty. With Yoritomo leaning on him hard, Yasuhira chose what he thought was self-preservation, and in 1189 his troops surrounded Yoshitsune's residence on the Koromo River. What happened there became one of the most retold last stands in Japanese history. Yoshitsune's giant retainer, the warrior monk Benkei, is said to have held the bridge alone, while arrows turned him into a pincushion. According to legend, he died on his feet, still blocking the way long after the life had left him. Inside, with the walls closing in, Yoshitsune saw to it that his young wife and small daughter wouldn't be taken alive, and then performed the ritual of seppuku. He was about 30 years old, and he had seen one of the fastest reversals of fortune in history. Yasuhira had the head preserved in alcohol, sealed in that black lacquered chest, and sent south as a trophy, but it bought him nothing. Yasuhira, despite having done it on the orders of Yoritomo, had killed his own half-brother, and Yoritomo moved to wipe out the entire northern Fujiwara clan within months. For the Japanese people, the idea that a warrior and commander of such great ability could simply be wiped out so quickly didn't sit well. That refusal is the soil the whole legend grew in, and the circumstances of his death practically fertilized it. Here was a beloved hero brought down by a brother's jealousy rather than honest defeat, dying in a remote corner of the country with no impartial witnesses to swear to what really happened. And then there was that head, which had spent weeks rotting in wine before anyone official could examine it. This meant nobody could actually say with any degree of certainty that it belonged to the man it was supposed to. Starting a couple of centuries after his death, the narrative of his life grew a new final chapter, one where he didn't die at Koromogawa at all. The first version kept him close to home, and this version is actually more compelling because it's theoretically possible. In it, Yoshitsune escaped the siege, fled across the water to the island we now call Hokkaido, and lived out his days among the Ainu, the indigenous people of the north. Believers pointed to Ainu reverence for a Japanese hero, a figure sometimes called Okikurumi, and decided he and the vanished samurai were one and the same. Shrines went up in honor of this hero on the island, and a few still stand, but whether this is actually related to Yoshitsune or not remains unproven. For a long time, that was as far as the legend reached, a hero who'd found peace at the northern edge of the known world of medieval Japan. Then, in the comfortable centuries of the Edo period, the era when most of what we think constitutes ancient Japanese tradition solidified, something interesting happened. People began to question why such a great hero would simply stop in what were then the desolate wastes of Hokkaido. The Asian mainland was just across the water, and out on the Mongolian steppe, history happened to be cooking up the perfect candidate for a second life. The timing is what hooks people, since the great warrior, under the theory that he actually lived, vanished from the historical record in 1189. A short while later, a previously obscure figure named Temujin started welding the fractured Mongol tribes into a single force. By 1206, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan at a great gathering of powerful Mongol rulers, and he was declared to be the ruler of everything under the vast sky. A legendary samurai disappears in the north, a world conqueror appears in the west, and the gap between the two is just wide enough to fill in the rest. The first and most obvious question here should be whether there's any evidence for this historical mystery, and I'll start with what true believers actually claimed. They start with the established fact that samurai were trained primarily in archery, horsemanship, and tactics, which fits well with what they knew of the Mongols. From there, everything about the theory becomes increasingly less rooted in anything we could call accurate history. The Minamoto fought under white flags, the Taira under red, and white was the color of Yoshitsune's house. Genghis Khan, the believers noted, marched under a white standard too, which is actually historically accurate. They also claimed that at his coronation, he raised up Minamoto-style flags and even claimed descent from a people far away on an island. This part is, perhaps unsurprisingly, not attested in any sources other than secondary accounts written centuries later by believers in this historical theory. The centerpiece of the whole argument is the meaning of the word Genghis or Chinggis, which isn't known for certain. Read the characters of Yoshitsune's name in their Sino-Japanese form, and you can squeeze out something like Gengi-kei. According to true believers, this echoes the proper pronunciation of Genghis used by the Mongolians themselves. They argued that Gengi-kei when pronounced by 13th century Mongolians, was, in essence, them trying to say the Chinese version of Yoshitsune's name. There's no real evidence to support this, but since the meaning of the title is ultimately unknown, this can't actually be proven or disproven. What can be disproven is the next claim that the believers make, and some of them tie the title Khan to the Japanese word kami, meaning a god. The problem with that is that Khan is a word, likely of Turkic origin, that has been attested in the written records since at least the 6th century AD. The title had been used by Mongols for centuries prior to Genghis Khan, and in actuality, he was proclaimed Great Khan in 1206, having already held the title Khan before that. What turned this somewhat bizarre folktale into a national obsession wasn't a Mongolian document from the Yuan Empire or an archaeological dig. It was politics, and two men in particular, who took up the idea to boost Japan's national standing in the West and at home after the Meiji Restoration in the mid-19th century. The first was a scholar named Suematsu Kenchu, who, while studying at Cambridge in 1879, introduced the idea to Westerners. He wrote an English-language thesis arguing flatly that the great conqueror and the Japanese hero were the same person. His timing wasn't innocent, since Japan had just thrown off centuries of isolation. The nation was racing to be taken seriously by Western powers, and suggesting a Japanese man had founded the largest land empire in history was useful for Victorian-era prestige. The idea really detonated in 1924 when an amateur historian named Oyabe Zenichiru, a Christian missionary and educator who'd spent years among the Ainu on Hokkaido, took it up. He published a book whose title plainly declared Genghis Khan to have been Yoshitsune. It became a runaway bestseller, and many people took it at face value, but perhaps not for the most innocent reason. Japan was deep into a national project of enriching the country and strengthening the army, with hungry eyes on Manchuria and Mongolia. Japan would, within a decade, establish a puppet state in Manchuria, though it never realized any claims on Mongolia due to Soviet protection. A narrative in which a Japanese hero had personally fathered the Mongol Empire was extraordinarily convenient for a nation preparing to march into exactly that territory. Here's where the historical mystery runs into the actual contemporary documents from the Mongols themselves. The Mongols left their own account of Genghis Khan's origins, a chronicle composed not long after his death that traces his ancestry, his birth, and his hard upbringing on the steppe. It's the biography of a Mongol boy named Temujin, born to a Mongol family, with no missing years, where a foreign samurai might be slotted in. The most widely accepted estimate puts Temujin's birth around 1162, which makes him roughly the same age. However, aside from that historical coincidence, the dates are much worse for the theory than the believers let on. By 1186, 3 full years before Yoshitsune supposedly died at Koromogawa, Temujin already had children of his own out on the steppe, including the son who'd one day inherit the empire. Perhaps I'm stating the obvious here, but a man can't have founded a dynasty on the steppe while still living in northern Japan. After 1945, with the Japanese Empire in ruins, the theory lost its grip, partly because the appetite for nationalist myth-making had soured, but it was also partly out of a recognition that telling the Mongolian people their founding hero was secretly a Japanese castaway was, at best, an insult. It would almost be like Romanians claiming that George Washington was secretly a Wallachian prince who fled the Ottoman Turks to establish the United States. To say that such a belief would cause some unnecessary diplomatic tensions may be an understatement. Yet, despite every legitimate Japanese historian now accepting that this theory has no basis in reality, the legend never fully went away, with the internet giving it some new life. It still occasionally surfaces because in the end it was never really a claim about Mongolia at all. It was about a country that loved a national hero too much to accept that he almost certainly met a brutal end at the hands of his own brother. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to leave a comment telling me what topics you'd like covered in the future, or just drop a quick "I'm doing my part." Pull up almost any European world map drawn between the 1500s and the 1800s, and you'll find a country sitting across the top of Asia that seems distinctly out of place. It's labeled Tartary, or sometimes Great Tartary, and on the older maps it's enormous, a single name sprawled from the edge of Eastern Europe across all of Siberia. From there it travels down toward the borders of China and India, and to a modern eye it looks like proof of something. Here's a vast nation, printed confidently by the best mapmakers of their day, and then it's gone. No textbook talks about it, and no museum displays anything from this supposed state, at least not under the name Great Tartary. That question has launched one of the strangest history theories on the internet, and according to its believers, Tartary wasn't just a placeholder name on a map. It was a lost empire, a technologically advanced, globe-spanning civilization that built the world's most beautiful architecture before being wiped from memory in a deliberate cover-up. The truth is stranger and, in its own way, far more interesting because Tartary was real. It just wasn't anything like what these theorists imagine. To comprehend why the maps were labeled as Great Tartary, you have to start with a word, and the word starts with terror. In the early 1200s, the armies of Genghis Khan came out of the eastern steppe and tore into the settled world with a speed that nobody in Europe or the Middle East could quite process. The Chinese, the other victims of this invasion, were far more familiar with recent incursions of steppe nomads into their land, but even Chinese historians were shocked by the Mongols. The people doing the conquering went by various names, but one group the Mongols had absorbed were known as the Tatars. That's the name that stuck to all of them in the Western imagination, with one small variant. When word of these horsemen reached Latin Christendom, frightened chroniclers and clergy didn't simply write down Tatar. They added an extra letter, turning Tatar into Tartar, and that small change carried significant weight in their minds. Tartarus, in classical Greek and Roman myth, was the pit beneath the underworld, the deepest dungeon reserved for the damned. So the invaders effectively became people from hell, and the linguistic similarity between the word Tatar and Tartarus played a major role. A French king of the era is said to have leaned into the grim pun, suggesting the Tartars ought to be shoved back down into Tartarus. So before Tartary was ever a place on a map, it was an insult soaked in fear of the Mongols and their allies. It didn't describe a nation or a single people with any precision, and it was never meant to. It was a catch-all that Europeans slapped onto the huge, half-unknown interior of Asia and everyone who came galloping out of it. Travelers like Marco Polo wrote of Tartars, and so did diplomats, traders, and missionaries, applying the same word to virtually any steppe peoples. But that's exactly what makes it so confusing, since, of course, there really were a people who called themselves Tatars. They were, and still are, distinct peoples with their own languages and history, and groups like the Crimean Tatars built real, organized states of their own. So the word always had a thread of something true running through it, which is precisely what makes it such fertile ground for a myth. For the next few centuries, Great Tartary was depicted on virtually all maps that depicted the world. When the great Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius published his landmark atlas in 1570, it included a map of Tartary subtitled as "The Realm of the Great Khan." It covered an enormous portion of the globe, Eastern Europe's fringe, the whole Siberian north, and a generous slice of what's now China. But here's the thing you have to understand about that map, because it wasn't drawn from knowledge. It was drawn from the lack of it. European geographers in 1570 had almost no reliable information about the interior of Asia. They knew the coastlines, they knew the trade route cities, and past that they had rumor, travelers' tales, and a great deal of blank parchment. Tartary was the word they used to fill the blank, because they knew that's where the Mongols and their allies came from. As real exploration crept inland over the next 200 years, the single Tartary began to fracture. Mapmakers started carving it into pieces with modifiers attached. There was Chinese Tartary, covering Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet under the Qing dynasty. There was Russian or Muscovite Tartary, meaning Siberia, and the lands the Tsars were steadily swallowing. And then there was independent Tartary, the Central Asians, composed of people like the Kazakhs, that hadn't yet been absorbed by anyone. These weren't a unified state answering to one throne by any means, and the creators of the maps understood that, as did the people of the time. They were different peoples under different rulers, grouped beneath one tired old label out of sheer habit. The believers loved to point at one document in particular, the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, printed in 1771. This entry described Tartary as a vast country in the north of Asia, inhabited by a variety of Turco-Mongolian people. To them, that settles the matter, because a respected reference book called it a country. But read it the way its own authors meant it, and country there means a region, a stretch of land, the way you'd talk about Texas Hill Country or wine country. That same edition freely admitted how little Europeans actually knew about the place. It wasn't certifying an empire, but rather, it was describing a frontier nobody in the West had properly surveyed. The reason for that splintering of Tartary over time was simple, because Europeans were finally getting real data on what actually existed there. As the Russian Empire pushed its way across Siberia and the Qing dynasty consolidated its grip on the eastern steppe, the blank parchment started filling in. The more anyone learned about the place, the less sense it made to keep pretending it was one thing. By the 1800s, as ethnographers and imperial surveyors finally mapped the region in detail, the word Tartary simply dissolved into better named places. They were now words we're now familiar with, like Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan, and Manchuria, and Tartary retired into the drawers of antique map dealers. There was no cover-up, of course. There was only cartography catching up with the reality of the situation on the ground. So how does a retired map label become a bizarre theory about a suppressed super-civilization? That part has a surprisingly specific origin story. The seed was planted in the Soviet Union, and it grew from there to where it stands today. Starting in the 1970s and 80s, a mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko began promoting something he called the New Chronology. This was an elaborate claim that essentially all of recorded history is a fabrication, that the ancient and medieval past was either invented or wildly miscounted. Under this theory, the true timeline is far shorter than we think, and specifically designed to cover up the true glory of Russia. It's nonsense by every standard of actual evidence, but it's ambitious nonsense, and it found an audience. From there, a Russian writer named Nikolai Levashov fused those ideas with more nationalist mythology. He recast Great Tartaria as a glorious lost Slavic empire that had been erased by enemies of the Russian people. The name itself was just one more form of erasure of the glory of the Russians, a sort of humiliation ritual. In its original form, this was a fantasy, a narrative about stolen national greatness, and without the internet, that's where it likely would have stopped. Then, around 2016, the idea jumped languages and platforms. On Reddit, YouTube, and other corners of the English-speaking internet, Tartaria got stripped of its Russian nationalist baggage and rebuilt into something looser and more global. In this new version, Tartaria wasn't merely Russian, and it wasn't just confined to the steppes. It was everywhere. It became a worldwide empire of staggering sophistication that had supposedly raised the planet's grandest buildings, from cathedrals to capitol domes. Then, just over a century ago, Great Tartaria was scrubbed from the history books for reasons that aren't entirely coherent. Part of the appeal was obvious from the start, and it looked to the great architecture produced in centuries prior. The theory flattered anyone who'd ever looked up at an ornate old train station, then over at a bland modern one, and wondered whether we'd lost something important along the way. Believers point to the ornate, palatial structures thrown up for the great world's fairs, like the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. They also point to Chicago's dazzling White City of 1893, and they argue that no society of that era could possibly have built something so beautiful so quickly, only to tear it down again. Surely, they reason, these were salvaged Tartarian buildings, photographed for posterity, and then demolished to bury the evidence. The same suspicion gets pointed at other demolished landmarks as well, not just temporary buildings put up for world fairs. The original Pennsylvania Station in New York, a soaring temple of glass and steel, was knocked down in the 1960s. Then there's the so-called mud flood, which is how I heard about this bizarre historical theory to begin with. Across plenty of old cities, you can find buildings whose windows or doorways now sit oddly below street level, half swallowed by the ground. To a believer, that's proof of a continent-burying cataclysm of mud that drowned the old empire and reset civilization from scratch. The same logic gets applied to star-shaped forts, those geometric stone fortifications found all over Europe. The theory reimagines star forts as power plants, antennas for harvesting energy straight out of the atmosphere. Even the apparent abundance of orphans in the 1800s gets folded in, explained away as young people rounded up after the world had been wiped clean. The trouble is that every one of those quote-unquote clues has a fully documented answer. Those star forts were developed in Italy beginning in the mid-1400s for one very specific reason, which was cannons. Tall medieval castle walls shattered under cannon fire, so engineers built low, angled, star-pointed ramparts that deflected cannonballs and let defenders volley back with overlapping fire. They look mysterious only if you don't know what artillery did to medieval architecture. For 3 centuries, these forts got bigger, and they were simply the smartest way to survive a siege. The doorways and windows have an answer too, and it's one that cities are rather proud of. Chicago in the 1850s literally jacked its streets up by several feet to install a sewer system and drain its swampy ground, leaving old ground floors stranded below the new roadway. This means that in certain areas, old buildings appear as though they are partly submerged. Seattle did much the same after its Great Fire, regrading whole blocks a full story higher to build out sewers. Other buildings have similar partly submerged appearances because, over the centuries, the buildings have gradually subsided into the land they were built on. The massive temporary buildings of the 19th and early 20th century are one of the favorite arguments of Great Tartaria theorists. Those seemingly impossible World's Fair exposition buildings were never built to last more than a single year. The gleaming white palaces of Chicago's fair were steel-framed sheds dressed in something called staff, a cheap mixture that could be poured into molds. They dried fast and were painted to mimic marble, and it was, essentially, stage scenery at massive architectural scale. The whole White City in Chicago stood for barely 6 months, and within a year of the fair closing, most of it had been pulled down or lost to fire. As for the general grandeur of 19th century buildings, their architects had trained in the neoclassical manner, the height of fashion at the time. The orphans have a paper trail as well, and they come from a time when mortality rates were exceedingly high. What seems now to be an unusual amount of orphans is actually just what happens when families were huge, and both parents could easily end up 6 feet under due to cholera or tuberculosis. Of course, this theory of a grand world-spanning empire also completely lacks any documentary evidence whatsoever. No person living through the time ever wrote about it, which is a problem in a society where people were literate, and we have their writings. In the end, Tartary was a real label for a real part of the world, and the Tatars are a real people who still live in Russia and Central Asia to this day. The closest thing to a great Tartarian empire to ever exist was the Mongol Empire, which, as we know, wasn't some sort of high-tech lost empire. And just as a quick footnote, this is perhaps one of the oddest historical mysteries I've ever covered. The idea that a placeholder name on a map ended up inspiring a bizarre internet theory centuries later is something so remote and weird that no one could have ever predicted it. And yet, for some reason, there's still multiple active subreddits promoting this pseudo-historical rabbit hole. Picture a global superpower at the height of its reach, a monarchy whose territory stretched across 4 continents. It was the first empire on which the sun never set, and its reputation for conquest is amongst the most brutal history has produced. But this empire, at one point, paused to ask a few thousand villagers on the far side of the planet a strange question. Did they want to be ruled by the crown of Spain? And if the answer came back no, the crown was supposedly prepared to pack up and leave. That's the premise behind one of the oddest episodes in colonial history, a series of consultations carried out across the Spanish Philippines in 1599. By the time these consultations happened, Spain had been in the islands for more than 30 years. Miguel López de Legazpi's expedition had landed in 1565, Manila fell under Spanish control by 1571, and the usual machinery of empire followed close behind. There were tribute demands, forced labor, encomiendas handed out to soldiers, and a steady stream of friars to convert the local populace. On paper, it looked like every other conquest of the age, but something unusual was brewing back in Spain, in the lecture halls of its universities. A generation of theologians and jurists, the thinkers we now group under the School of Salamanca, had been picking apart the moral foundation of the whole colonial project. Francisco de Vitoria argued that the indigenous peoples of newly encountered lands were the true and rightful owners of their territory. He believed they were fully capable of governing themselves, regardless of whether they were Christian or how the Spanish rated their level of civilization. Bartolomé de las Casas had spent decades hammering the same point about the problems in the Americas. Out of all this came a genuinely radical idea for the period. A king couldn't simply seize a people and declare them subjects. Legitimate rule needed some form of consent by the populations that were taken over. It was a sharp break from the old habit carried over from the Americas, where Spanish parties had read out a formal demand of submission. That process, known as requerimiento, involved conquistadors reading declarations to listeners who didn't speak a word of Spanish, then treated their silence as a yes. The idea that colonial subjects needed some buy-in to the empire sailed to Manila in the person of Domingo de Salazar. He was a Dominican who became the city's first bishop and arrived in 1581 already steeped in the Las Casas tradition. Salazar was hearing reports, often from Filipinos directly, about how badly they were being treated by Spanish officials and soldiers, and he was appalled. In 1582, he convened a synod in Manila, a gathering of clergy and learned men, to work out what the church should actually do about it. The assembly asked, in effect, whether the King of Spain had any just title to rule these islands at all. If he didn't, then every tribute collected and every order given rested on nothing but brute force. That's an extraordinary question for a colonial church to put to its own crown, and the men asking it weren't fringe troublemakers. They were the senior religious authorities of the colony. Salazar pushed the cause so hard that in his final years, he sailed all the way back to Spain to argue it at court in person, and he died in Madrid in 1594, before he could see where any of it led. Word of this traveled back to Madrid, and the crown took it seriously, partly because Philip II had already been steering Spanish expansion in a more cautious direction. Years earlier, he'd issued ordinances that quietly retired the word conquest in favor of pacification, at least in official language. So when the pressure from the Spanish Philippine clergy reached him, the answer wasn't the expected brush-off. On the 8th of February, 1597, Philip II issued a royal decree addressed to the governor of the Philippines. It ordered him to make sure the tribute laws were obeyed, to see that Filipinos were repaid for taxes wrongly taken, and, most striking of all, to obtain their free submission to the crown. The document framed it as the people freely giving themselves over to the king. Read with modern eyes, the implication is bold. If that free submission wasn't given, then Spain had no claim to be there at all. The decree reached Manila on the 5th of August, 1598, and landed on the desk of Governor Francisco de Tello, who'd taken charge of the colony 2 years earlier. He set about organizing the thing province by province. Instructions went out to the alcaldes, the local Spanish administrators, and to the religious orders working in each district. The people doing the answering were, in practice, the chiefs and leading men who'd run Filipino society long before the Spanish turned up, and who now spoke for their towns. Under Spanish rule, these individuals had held on to a slice of local authority, collecting tribute and managing their communities as a junior layer of the colonial order. This made them the obvious people to register a yes to submission to the Spanish crown, since they were beneficiaries of the system. What survives of Tello's own reporting gives a real sense of how the entire referendum process unfolded. In some areas, such as around Manila, where the Spanish presence was strongest, answers came in agreeing to submission to the crown very rapidly. However, in more far-flung territories, many of the headmen of the villages asked the colonial authorities for more time to think about it. These villagers were given as much as a year to mull it over and decide whether they wanted to be part of Spain or not. It's worth being frank about what this was and wasn't, since nobody walked into these towns handing out secret ballots. The question was put by the same colonial and religious authorities who held all the power to a local elite that had every practical reason to say yes. This was also done in a setting where a flat refusal was hard to picture actually being honored. Further, there may have been the implicit threat that a village leader who didn't want to be part of the crown would be replaced with one who did. There's also the matter of who was reporting the votes, with many of the people doing it being agents of powerful Spanish nobles on the islands. I find it hard to believe that these people would have been incentivized in any way to accurately report the voting. Further, others who were reporting the votes and explaining what the vote actually was came from the church. I suspect that while they may have not had the same economic incentive, they wanted to promote the idea that the people governed were willingly part of the crown of Spain. The recorded results, to the extent they exist, came back positive in favor of Spain absolutely everywhere, which I suppose should come as no surprise. And here's the part that gives the whole affair its peculiar, unfinished quality. The man who set it in motion was already gone. Philip II had passed on the 13th of September, 1598, barely 40 days after his decree was published in Manila. The news traveled so slowly that nobody in the islands knew it until the middle of 1599, with the consultations already underway. They were, at the end of the day, carrying out the will of a king who no longer existed, for a crown, as we will see, that no longer cared. Tello wrote up the results and sent them to the crown in a letter in July of 1599, describing the provinces that had submitted and the ones still asking for time. That letter never got its answer, and the counting stayed incomplete. The question of the holdout provinces hung in the air, and it would stay that way forever. Under the new king, Philip III, the Spanish crown simply moved along to other concerns. The grand consultation about whether Spain had the right to be in the Philippines faded out without a verdict, its loose ends never tied off. Spain, of course, stayed, and it would govern the islands for nearly 3 more centuries, despite the voting never being finished. Whether the results of the referendum would have been honored if it came back in the negative remains a historical unsolved mystery. Personally, though, I think the voter base says it all, because everyone who had the right to vote had, by this point, become dependent on the Spanish crown for their own power and authority. In general, people don't vote to give up their own power, and I'm sure more than a few headmen simply thought the entire exercise was a trick to root out disloyal elements.